and we are going to be going over her book, which I was very happy to endorse. It's Contemplative Witnessing, BIPOC-Centered Spiritual Direction. It's just one of these books you're not going to see much of. That's why it's so needed. And I felt like it really fits a gap area in books. And um, far too little is written about it or noticed. And for me, it's just one of those must read type of books. So I'm just so happy, Cindy, that you continue to um, not just have a voice, but stake a claim that really should be there. And for what is called, I think it's called like it's like the majority of the world is non-white. And yet, at least in this country, you don't get that sense at all. And so it's kind of a recentering. So thank you so much for returning to the podcast to speak with me.
Yeah, it's really great to be with you again, Lisa, and I'm excited to be in this conversation with you. And thank you for supporting the book. And I hope that what it does is encourage other people to write their experiences, because I can only write from my own experience, which is limited. But I hope it like opens doors and encourages other people, people of color, to write about their experiences as spiritual directors, and that we can keep filling out the story with more and more particularity of people's different experiences.
Thank you. Well said. So there's three major parts to the book, and it's contemplative witnessing, sacred movements, and our collective spirit. And that's kind of what is the basic three themes of the book. And I'm going to also read from page, I think it's page 17 here. Let me just make sure I have this right. You talk a little bit about, first actually I wanted to talk about what you say. This plays back into this idea of a lot of people's experience in the BIPOC community, the non-white community, is a loss of our sacred self. And it's within the context of white-centeredness. And I would love for you to kind of unpack that a little more for me, as people who are listening haven't read the book yet, and they can kind of get a taste of what you're doing here.
Yes, I think the Western way, the white Western culture that we're in, is the uninterrogated norm. And so it's just assumed as the norm of human experience, which means any other experience that differs from that assumed social norm just becomes often erased or not noticed. And I think that happens in churches, in spirituality as well, that there becomes a Western norm to our spirituality, to spiritual direction, even, and how we practice spiritual direction, which then doesn't reflect the spiritual experiences, the faith for people that come from other different cultural traditions and experiences, which means then a neglect of self, a loss of self, when it's not reflected or welcomed or invited into our spiritual spaces.
Right. And it is a kind of it's erasure. It's also sort of never being seen, never being heard. And in a sense, it feels like you're gaslit. It's like, this is how things are. But your own sense of being and your sense of living says, no, I don't, this isn't jiving. This isn't matching. And these things for non-white people, and for me, I'm kind of this bridge person, having a Latina background, white, definitely white passing, having that privilege of white passing, but really having a cultural experience of non-whiteness, especially in my most formative years, and realizing, this is so weird. There's this preferred group of people. They get these special treats or something. And just seeing this misalignment. And so as people who are non-white listening to this or watching this in clips and stuff, there's going to be different feelings about this and different responses depending on where you're coming from and what your life experience is. But it's really important for ministers and spiritual directors to know, and this is really why you've written this book, Cindy, is that this very real experience, you can't minister to people unless you understand this real experience of the loss of our sacred self. It isn't going to help if you try to just get people to assimilate into white centeredness, because it's just going to never align. It's going to never really make sense. And um, I don't, I understand that white people and white culture don't understand that. But as more voices and more books are written, little lights go off like, maybe this has been centered around us, you know. And so these little steps are made. But I think the more we normalize the plurality of voices and perspectives and cultures and experiences, the more we'll realize this centering on Western whiteness is this weird aberration in human history, for sure. But even in modernity, and we'll see where that takes us. But I think that just off the bat, it's important to say that your book, I love how you say it. It's kind of like, this isn't going to be written for white people, you know, and yet white people can learn so much by reading it, right? So maybe I'll just ask another question. When you're writing for the souls and hearts and the soul care of non-white people, but you're assuming that white people are going to probably read it. I'm sure you'll get some people who are just sort of disconnected from that. Like, well, why aren't you talking to us? You know,
Mm-hmm.
um, what is your response, or you know, what do you need to say for those types of people?
Yeah, it's interesting because if I am talking to a group of white spiritual directors, for example,
Mm-hmm.
what I say there is different than when I'm talking to a group of people of color, or maybe all Asian Americans, or um, uh, uh, a multi-ethnic audience. And it's because the needs are different. And what we need to address is different. With white folks, then there needs to be more explaining of the experiences of people of color. And sometimes for myself, right, I can feel myself getting into a defensive
Mm-hmm.
posture, needing to defend certain things, which then is not freeing for myself as a speaker or a writer. Whereas if I'm speaking to or writing to people of color, then it's about our own liberation. And what does that mean? Not needing to defend or explain, right? We can skip that part of the conversation
Mm-hmm.
and just move on to what does our own liberation look like? What does our own spirituality look like? And it's a whole new conversation, or not new, but a whole different conversation to be had.
Actually love that starting point. I love that starting point. And that's kind of um, another reason why I've enjoyed reading womanist theologians too. It just, we'll just start there, and that's fine with me. I'm not disoriented. I know who's writing this. I know why they're writing it, but it's a refreshment to my soul, because the voices, I haven't heard them. So when I hear them, I'm like, oh, yeah, yeah, okay, thank you. I needed some of that, you know, and I hope that people are challenged to read, to diversify their reading selections, and sometimes just asking. I've noticed just asking people who, what's the latest book that you've read by a woman or a woman of color that really had an impact. Of course, that if they're willing to be honest, a lot of them can't even recall that they ever read one. But for the people who are, that can call them into accountability, but that can also be like, yeah, well, maybe I'm missing out. And that's a role that I feel like that I need to kind of push push with people. But I love the part where that's all skipped too. And we just get down to business. So the one page I was going to read on page 17 talks about communal silence and response. And I just wanted to read a little bit here because it's just lovely. I just wanted to make sure that we get a taste of it, the listeners get a taste. It says, in contemplative witnessing, a communal silence is a way of honoring what was spoken. It is a thick and tangible silence that affirms what was heard and surrounds the one being witnessed. In this communal silence, we witness through our felt experience. We can continue listening to one another, not through words, but through a shared connection. Silence, however, is not the end. The communal silence witnesses attune to our own internal reactions and responses in order to discern what is our own to keep and what is a response or a question that may be offered to the ones we witness. And as I was reading this, it's not a surprise, of course, that silence and having enough space for silence with other people is one of these much more rare things, unless you're really in the world of spiritual direction, unless you're really, really immersed in it. And I guess I'm just asking, like, if you were to expand on that or to make a comment on that, um, what, I guess I'm just kind of drawing you out a little bit more and towards that to explain
Yeah, I think the role of silence in the contemplative tradition is really powerful. Most often set as within an individual kind of private context of spiritual practices for yourself or whatnot. But I think, silences can also be very powerfully experienced in community, where it's not we're connecting to each other, not just with our words, but with our bodies, with our presence. At the same time, what it's not just silence for silence sake, right? It's silence to witness each other, which is exactly why the book is called Contemplative Witnessing, the power of witnessing each other's stories and pains, as well as, ways in which we're evolving and growing, and to be witnessed in community is really powerful. And sometimes there are no words for what it is we're witnessing. And so we feel each other, right? We are present to each other in what we share. At the same time, I think the value of silence is tricky, because silence is not the end, right? And silence cannot be used just to ignore injustices and harms. And so witnessing is also how we respond to each other as a community. Even in that silence, there is something of what comes after that. What is the mirroring? What is the affirming? What is the calling out that is needed if we're in community with each other? And it includes both the verbal response, as well as the felt and physical responses with one another.
And there's something about, especially with spiritual directors, part of the training and part of the ongoing, you mentioned this, I'll mention this a little bit later, about checking in with ourselves to see if we have the space to hold things like that. But this capacity for beholding the other, and this kind of almost internal gaze that is, it's very life changing. When people come to these conversations having never experienced it, I'm just considering that some listeners might be like, what in the world is being spoken about here? But with a spiritual director, and there's room for silence within that relationship, within those sessions, it's not just silence in a boredom way. It is a witnessed silence. And it's very difficult to put into words what's happening and what you're in a sense getting out of it, and how you're both sort of being fortified by it. And at the same time, there's a kind of co-regulation in a way that happens like that. And that's why the director learns to set aside their own things to be present in that moment. but that discipline that it takes to do that, and the having done your own work first so that you don't get in the way of what's happening. This is why you need a trained director, not somebody who's just going to tell you, yes, I'm a spiritual director, let's sit down, and then you'll see, problematic things arise. And as we talk about silence, I wanted to bring up what's on page 27, which is I'm glad you brought it up, is the resistance to silence. That we will sometimes automatically have this resistance to silence. And you say, oftentimes our resistance to silence, slowing down, rest, and solitude isn't a resistance to the silence and stillness itself, but a resistance to confronting our honest selves. And that's just a really profound sentence. And I don't know if you need to explain it, it's sort of self explanatory. But I think that there's something very powerful there, that it is in that silence that you're sort of revealed. I don't know if you want to expand on that or follow that up with anything.
Yeah, I think that's a part of our modern culture, right? That we just live in a modern culture that resists silence. And so we're constantly filling our days with activity and distractions and noise and whatnot. And it's because as soon as we slow down, as soon as we stop, and even if it's just one moment, 1 minute, what happens in that slowing down, in the silence, in that solitude, is we have to face ourselves. And if we're not used to doing that, if we haven't been invited into that, then it can be really scary. So we just move on to the next distraction, turn on the TV, right? Turn on the noise so that we don't have to really meet ourselves and face ourselves. And often it's because we don't like who we see when we look at ourselves. And so it every moment of silence is an invitation to deep inner work and an inner look at ourselves. And it's easier to choose not to do that. And so, I have seasons where, I haven't been entering into meditation or prayer in this season. And then I know, oh, I'm avoiding something in myself. And so it's easier just not to have those sorts of practices or moments because I don't want to do something or I don't want to work on something in myself.
That draws me to jump ahead a little bit, because you talk about so adeptly cyclical healing instead of this step progression type of healing or linear healing that we're used to healing. But that cyclical healing is sort of, backing up what you're speaking about, seasons of, and I've totally felt it too. I'm sure this is super common, is that there's times when you feel very honest, everything's fine, and then maybe there's something happens, or a memory or an experience, and then you feel more vulnerable, you start shutting down a little bit, maybe you're not as honest, or you don't feel as transparent, or something. So it makes me wonder to ask you, are there practices in your life that you do to re-engage with the honesty, or is there some sort of check or balance or a catch that you're like, oh wait, now I know? Or is it just sort of like you realize this is the cycle and how it goes? I would just love to kind of, it's a little bit of like, let me pick your brain kind of question, but
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's always an invitation in our lives to healing and liberation.
mm-hmm.
That those invitations are just always there, set before us, but we always have a choice, right? Whether we engage with it or not. And those movements are often, as you said, or as you mentioned, cyclical. Like there's all of us have one or two sort of root issues that have been there since our childhoods. And then in each season of life, they come back in different forms or they evolve in different ways. And if we keep ignoring them and leaving them be, it will come out in unhealthy ways. But if we engage with them, often it's not the end. It's just you engage with it a little bit and you experience some healing and some freedom.
Mhm.
And then, a year or two later, 5 years later, it comes back and it may feel frustrating because you're like, oh, this again, didn't I deal with this?
Right.
But each time it comes back, it's a new invitation. There's deeper healing here. There's
Mhm.
more freedom I could experience here. So now let me be present to this next iteration, this next cycle of it. Um, so it may feel frustrating, but there are actually invitations each time it comes up.
I love the framing of it as cyclical, because in a spiritual formation way, because it doesn't mean you're doing something wrong if it comes back up again. It means that you're encountering it again at perhaps some deeper way, or some way that was hidden prior. And it doesn't mean that everything's gone wrong. And I've had conversations with friends before, and they're like, "Oh, I have an issue with my mom. I have an issue with jealousy. I have an issue, and it's back again. And I thought I dealt with it." And just realizing that that's actually part of the process, is that yes, it will have a pattern, a cycle, a season, and just to keep on with it, to keep engaging and to keep responding to the invitations, is such a potentially very hopeful, um, welcoming, even way to approach continual healing.
And we can give more compassion to ourselves then when it comes up, because when it comes up again is not the same, and we're not the same, right? So
Yeah.
it will be different each time as well.
Yeah. And I think also we have, if we're in a sense doing the work, we have more capacity too. So we probably have more grace and more perspective to see things differently. Like you're saying, we are different the next time it's approached. And I wanted to then now come back to that, checking in to see if we have the space, where you say here, let's see if I can find it. Um, Page 36, if spaciousness can be a presence we carry, then as a contemplative witness, we can intentionally cultivate this spaciousness. A question I ask myself daily is, do I have the space in myself today to be present to another human being? If I have directees for the day, or if I plan to be in community, then I check in with myself. If I don't have space in myself, I can cause harm to the community through inattentiveness, impatience, or reactivity. there may there are many spiritual practices we can do to open up our spaciousness. And then you go on, and I also want to mention that you have a lot of things in here that are very practical spiritual practices that you invite people into. That is really, really helpful as we begin to kind of adjust, make space, and see things differently as we're interacting with ourselves and other people. But so this practice that you do of checking in with yourself, and then I guess you have to have the boundaries to say to people, there's been a change of plans. Or, maybe you can walk us through that a little bit. What does that look like, checking in?
Yeah, anytime that we're in community, it's a responsibility that we hold to be with people. And often we engage with people in our work life, or with family members, or with community members, um, unintentionally. Like, we don't put any intention into our engagements, we just interact with people.
Mhm.
And as we know, lots of harm can happen, lots of conflicts can happen. Community is messy. And so, how do we form ourselves to be in healthy community?
Mhm.
We can't control other people, but what we can do is how we what we can change is how we show up, and hopefully that invites people into their healing and how they show up. Which means for me asking this simple question: do I have space in myself today to be present to another person, to be present in community? And I take that as a responsibility. And so if I don't have that spaciousness, then primarily I need to make sure I do. So that means stop everything, take a break,
Mhm.
walk outside, do what I need to do to cultivate that spaciousness.
Mhm.
Because what I want to offer, who I want to be in community, is someone who gives spaciousness to others. So, and to be fully present to them. And especially as a spiritual director, I'm reminded all the time how I can cause harm. Like if I enter into the conversation just tired, right? And it's simple carelessness or inattentiveness. But in spiritual direction, people are speaking very vulnerably, pouring out their souls to you. And so even inattentiveness, even carelessness
Mm.
can cause harm if I'm not fully present to what they're sharing. So it's, I think it's part of the work of a spiritual director is not the meeting with people, is the work in themselves in order to meet with people. And is that checking, do I have space for other people today? If not, that's my responsibility to work on that.
Mm. And it's beautiful really to see the kind of people who go into spiritual direction. um, I'm not going to try to play any favorites here. But when someone goes into spiritual direction to make space for other people, and then prior to that they are working on themselves so that they don't get in the way of the process and the beauty of holding space and the healing that can happen and stuff like that. It is really a unselfish thing to do. It is very unselfish. However, it is also not selfish, but it's self-care first. So you aren't going in there blundering and bleeding and all over the place. You have to take care of business first in order to be helpful. But at the same time, it's a commitment as a spiritual director that you're willing to lay aside your things in order for something bigger to happen that's bigger than yourself. And so it's this framework. And and this must be really, I know I'm saying the obvious, Cindy, and you're probably like, well, duh, Lisa, yeah. But when you think about our culture, and you talk about things being transactional later, um, our culture can be, or maybe that was in your other book. I quoted it in my book. It's been really on my mind about how Western culture is transactional. Even when we're trying to be communal and community based, we're still kind of coming in as individuals and being transactional. And that is such a salient point. For a spiritual director, it is really not transactional. You are entering into the session, and transactional can't be part of this like landscape here. Um, I guess I'm wondering a little bit, as I talk to you, and you train spiritual directors. Do you sense that there's a Western mindset of transactionalism that works its way into, that you have to train out of people in a way as you spiritually direct them, or is that a Western white person problem, or is it a little bit of both? Or
No,
I'm just
I think that's in everyone. So when I teach new spiritual directors, one of the main things I tell them is this is not about learning a skill.
mm,
It's not about how you facilitate good conversations and ask good questions. That's actually
mm,
not what we're learning here. What spiritual direction training does is what makes it so hard is you have to engage your own inner work. You have to be very self-aware, know what your mental chatter is all about. Like you have to be aware of all of those things and committed to continually engage your own inner work, because that then is what will make an open, spacious, non-judgmental space that you can offer to others, so that when you meet with another person, with a group of people, then you are simply offering presence and welcome and not needing anything from the people that you meet with. And so, not needing them to affirm you
mm,
or to tell you that, oh, this was the most amazing experience, because it may not be, right? It doesn't need to be.
mhm,
All you need to do is offer an open space. But
mhm.
how you create that open space is actually very hard, because you need to clear out the stuff in yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very well said. Um, I mentioned just a minute ago how you have a lot of different practices in the book that you kind of introduce or guide us through. And it made me want to ask you which of those practices that you've included, or even one that you haven't included, come the most naturally for you, or that you draw on a lot to kind of bring you back to center.
Yeah, I do have daily practices which come from my own cultural tradition, and
Mhm.
so I like daily practice calligraphy, which in Chinese culture is considered a spiritual practice, and I
Mm.
daily practice Tai Chi, and both of them just they're embodied, right? So they require physical movements, but
Mhm.
the physical movements help clear out, right, your mind, help
Mm.
clear out your heart. So it just clears out the clutter that may be in there. So both of those I found very very helpful.
And I'm glad you mentioned about movement, because I almost forgot to include that in what I was asking you. There is so much tendency, in my opinion, in Western culture to be like, brains on a stick going from room to room. And I do it too. I nerd out and I forget I have a body. and and when I engage with my culture, my Latina culture, it's very embodied with dance and music. And it's, I think how my ancestors survived. If they kept moving and working through the somatic ways to get through trauma, that's what helped very much. And so as you're speaking about these embodied spiritual practices, i I'm of the opinion that the more the better of these, if possible, to integrate them in. And I'm wondering, some of, besides what you've said, are there other, like, if you could name like one or two other embodied practices that you feel like generally have helped people that you've interacted with. I would love for people to hear more, like, okay, instead of just praying and staying in my head, or even like Lectio Divina, like what would you say are some more embodied spiritual practices people could engage with a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, embodied practices can be very simple, right? They don't have to be complex, like you have to learn a whole new exercise or whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
They can be just very simple things that we do. Because, the reason for practicing something like Tai Chi or Qigong is really they believe in the power of breath. These are breath practices.
Mm.
And so that's very easy to do is, it comes from Qigong and Tai Chi comes from a worldview where Qi means our physical breath and it means our life force and the sacred energy in all of nature, right? There, it's the same word, which means like our physical breathing is, even though it's simple, connected to our body, it also connects us to a bigger life force and sacred energy that's in the earth and in the trees and all around us. And so, some mornings it's very easily, I just step outside. It doesn't matter
Yeah.
what my schedule is for the day. I step outside and I just take deep breaths to start
Mm-hmm.
my day. And then particularly for like heavier spiritual direction sessions, I take a walk afterwards
Mm.
and just allow that walking just allows the physical release of whatever I feel I may be holding on to.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I have also, now I haven't done it because we've had like 4 or 5 days of rain, but I tend to do in the morning in my bare feet, go outside and touch grass and
Mm-hmm.
actually try to feel the ground and look towards the sun. And it's embodied, and I feel like I can start the day as myself in a sense, not just kind of, with the crazy monkey brain. And it's amazing how quickly, like, if I don't try to engage with a practice like that, how much of a disembodied, disassociative state I can be in without realizing it. Because I think in how I've responded to trauma, just as a little girl, or whatever, is just go away from my body, is just leave.
Mm-hmm.
And not really getting a handle on even understanding that till sort of recently, going, I'm not here. I haven't been here, for whatever reason. It was. it's an escape to leave your body if you're in pain, like psychic, physical, all the rest. And so the practice of just feeling the weight of your body, like feeling your feet on the ground, or like if you're sitting in a chair, feeling the ground, those are so simple, but for some reason they can be, for some of us anyway, um, just kind of overlooked. And then, we're wondering, well, why am I anxious? Well, some of it could be that you don't feel like you're in your body. um, so I'm glad that you include that. So as like a major pillar of your book, it's really helpful to recognize we are not just like a brain on a stick. We really are embodied, and we have to also realize that of other people and engage with other people in embodied ways too. Um,
Yeah. I think we learn that particularly from non-Western cultures that spirituality is primarily in the body and not something you study.
yes.
Yes. And so that means to engage in our spirituality, we have to engage in embodied practices. Even in Buddhist meditations, for example, like when meditating or praying, they don't close their eyes, right? They sort of do a half eyes open posture because keeping your eyes open keeps you present to your body rather than when you close your eyes, right? It takes you inward, right? Into, I don't know, the thought space, the heart space, but opening your eyes, I am right here, right now.
Yeah, you're still in touch with your world. And it's also helpful to note that, like, Jewish, we're talking about Jewish religion in terms of like the cradle of Christianity is Eastern, and it's about
Hmm.
doing. It's the Greeks that go up into the philosophy and into the head, right? So we're pulled out of an action oriented, you know, blood sacrifices. It's all this very visceral doing and action and bodily things. Um, those are part of the spirituality of the Semitic people, and it's, Southwestern Asia. So
Yeah.
um, it's the Middle East to some people, but to some other people, it's Southwestern Asia. So it is Eastern ways of embodied spirituality where there is no dichotomy of the material and the spiritual, or the body and the spirit. It's just regular life. It's just
Hmm.
one. And that that false dichotomy, I think, can create pathologies. Maybe that's a little strong to say, but it just seems like it can create certain kinds of pathologies for us.
Yeah.
So, so I'm wondering if there's just any kind of final message or invitations to listeners, or any kind of final message, whether it's about your work or it's about the book.
Yeah, I think as I said at the beginning, I hope like that each book that I put out there is actually an invitation for others to contribute their stories and their experiences as well. That each book opens up for people, right, a connection to themselves, which is then different than my experience. And as people really connect with themselves, they would want to share that with others in the world as well.
Very good. Contemplative Witnessing, BIPOC-Centered Spiritual Direction, Cindy S. Lee. Really love this, Cindy. And whatever you're doing next, of course, you always have an open door to come on. And thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me here, Lisa, and I really enjoyed conversing with you.